Hello, beautiful soul. I'm Aurora, and welcome to Twin Flame Journey, a space where we explore the deeper meaning behind soul connections, divine timing, and the path that leads two hearts back to union. If you've been feeling the signs, you're in the right place.
What happens when the divine masculine can no longer escape what he feels? What happens when silence stops bringing relief? When distance stops creating peace? When distraction stops numbing the ache? And the very patterns he used to survive begin turning against him? Because that is the moment everything changes. For a long time, avoidance may have felt like power, like safety, like emotional control, like the only way to stay functional while carrying feelings too deep, too confusing, or too dangerous to face directly. But what if avoidance was never peace? What if it was only a temporary shelter? And now that shelter is collapsing? What does he feel when he can no longer run? When the mind cannot silence the heart? When the old defenses stop protecting him and start exposing him? When the emptiness gets louder than the distraction? This is the part almost nobody talks about. Because when avoidance stops working, the divine masculine is not immediately calm. He is confronted, unraveled, humbled, flooded by truths he spent years trying to manage from a distance. And in this video, we are going deep into what the divine masculine actually feels in that phase. The pressure, the grief, the panic, the longing, the regret, the collapse, and the sacred awakening hidden inside all of it. Chapter 1: Why Avoidance Felt Safe for So Long. Before we can understand what the divine masculine feels when avoidance stops working, we have to understand why avoidance ever felt necessary in the first place. Because avoidance did not begin as evil. It began as protection. That is the truth people often miss. From the outside, avoidance can look cold, immature, confusing, even cruel. It can look like distance without explanation, silence after intimacy, emotional withdrawal when things become deeper, or a man disappearing into logic, work, routine, or detachment the moment real vulnerability begins to rise. But underneath that behavior is often a more painful reality. Avoidance once felt safe. For many divine masculines, avoidance was never just a bad habit. It was a survival strategy, a way of managing emotions that felt too overwhelming, too exposing, too dangerous to fully face. A way of staying functional in a world that may have rewarded self-control more than emotional truth. A way of protecting a heart that learned, somewhere along the way, that feeling too much came with risk. And once a strategy feels like survival, it becomes identity. He becomes the calm one, the controlled one, the one who does not need much, the one who can step back, the one who stays composed, the one who thinks instead of feels, the one who can walk away and still appear fine. That image matters more than most people realize, because it is not only how others see him, it is how he has learned to survive himself. If he grew up in environments where emotion was not safely held, then avoidance would have felt intelligent. If vulnerability led to shame, rejection, instability, criticism, or emotional unpredictability, then withdrawal would not have felt like weakness. It would have felt like wisdom. It would have felt like the only reliable way to keep the inner world from becoming too chaotic. So he adapted. He learned how to shut down before the feelings got too loud. He learned how to overthink instead of opening. He learned how to disappear inwardly while still functioning outwardly. He learned how to call silence space, control maturity, and emotional distance peace. And for a while it worked. That is what makes this so important to understand. Avoidance worked. It helped him regulate. It helped him avoid shame. It helped him maintain structure. It helped him look strong. It helped him remain in control in moments where truth might have made him feel too exposed. This is why the divine masculine often stays in avoidance for so long. Not because he feels nothing, but because avoidance once gave him something he deeply depended on: protection from emotional overwhelm. Think about that. If a man has spent years building a life around emotional management, then avoidance does not feel like running. It feels like staying stable. It feels like preserving order. It feels like preventing collapse. He may not consciously say, "I am avoiding because I am terrified," More often, he tells himself he is being rational, careful, practical, self-controlled, or just overwhelmed. But underneath those explanations, the nervous system may be saying something much simpler. This does not feel safe to fully enter. That is why avoidance can coexist with deep feeling. In fact, sometimes the deeper he feels, the stronger the avoidance becomes. Because real connection does not just awaken love. It awakens vulnerability, memory, need, longing, unprocessed grief, the fear of losing control, the fear of being seen too clearly, the fear that if he lets himself feel this fully, he will no longer be able to return to the version of himself that once felt more manageable. So he steps back. Not always because the connection is false. Sometimes because it is real enough to threaten the structure he has relied on to stay safe. This is where the misunderstanding begins. People assume avoidance means indifference. But often, avoidance means activation. He is too activated to stay close in the way truth would require. Too aware of what is being stirred. Too exposed by what he is feeling. Too uncertain of how to remain open without becoming emotionally flooded. So he does what he has always done. He withdraws. He goes quiet. He intellectualizes. He creates space. He delays. He tells himself he needs time to think. And maybe he does. But often, what he really needs is a way to feel without equating feeling with danger. That is the deeper wound. Because avoidance is rarely just about not wanting closeness. More often, it is about not trusting himself inside closeness. Not trusting what will happen if the walls come down. Not trusting whether he can stay grounded once the heart becomes more alive than the mind can control. This is especially true in spiritually intense or soul-level connections. Because ordinary relationships may allow a wounded masculine to stay partially hidden. He can participate just enough, feel just enough, keep enough control to maintain the image he has built. But when a connection touches him more deeply, when it bypasses the usual defenses and reaches something older, something more tender, something more sacred, avoidance often intensifies before transformation begins. Why? Because now it is not just about romance. It is about exposure. The connection becomes a mirror, a pressure point, a sacred disruption. It reveals where he is not whole, where he is still fragmented, where he still uses control instead of truth, where he still mistakes emotional absence for strength. And that kind of revelation can make avoidance feel even more necessary. Not forever, but for a season. Because if the old self has no better strategy, it will keep reaching for the one that once worked. This is why avoidance can feel so stubborn on the divine masculine path. It is not merely preference. It is pattern. It is conditioning. It is the accumulated intelligence of a nervous system that learned how to survive by backing away from what felt too emotionally demanding. And that pattern becomes deeply seductive because it offers immediate relief. Feeling too much? Step back. Heart opening too fast? Go quiet. Vulnerability rising? Retreat into thought. Connection becoming undeniable? Delay, rationalize, create distance. Each time he does this, the system learns. This is how we survive. Even if surviving is not the same as living. That is the hidden cost. Because avoidance may protect him from intensity in the short term, but it also protects him from healing. It protects him from honesty. It protects him from the emotional integration that sacred love is trying to awaken. It protects him from collapse. Yes, but it also protects the very walls that are keeping him from real peace. Still, in the beginning, he does not see it that way. In the beginning, avoidance feels like relief. It quiets things for a moment. It restores a sense of control. It helps him return to the identity he trusts more. The one who can function, produce, manage, stay composed, and not get lost inside emotion. That is why Chapter 1 matters so much. Because before avoidance becomes the prison, it feels like the rescue. Before it becomes loneliness, it feels like stability. Before it becomes self-betrayal, it feels like self-protection. Before it becomes the thing he must outgrow, it feels like the thing that kept him from drowning. And maybe once upon a time it did. Maybe when he was younger, or more wounded, or less supported, avoidance truly was the best he had. Maybe emotional truth was too dangerous in the environments that shaped him. Maybe silence was safer than honesty. Maybe distance really did protect him from more harm. That deserves compassion. Not excuse. Compassion. Because the divine masculine cannot truly heal what he only judges. He has to understand why avoidance was chosen before he can stop worshipping it. He has to see that it was not random. It was intelligent in the way wounded systems are often intelligent. It had a purpose. It solved a problem. It kept him moving. But now the question changes. Now the question is no longer, did avoidance help me survive? Now the question becomes, is avoidance still helping me live in truth? That is where the crack begins. Because once a man starts sensing that the strategy which once protected him is now costing him more than it saves, the whole path changes. He begins to feel the tension between the old definition of safety and the deeper call of the soul. He begins to sense that the very thing that once made him feel strong is now making him feel distant, tired, divided, and quietly unwell. But that comes later. In the beginning, avoidance still feels safe. Safe enough to trust. Safe enough to repeat. Safe enough to keep using even when the soul is already starting to outgrow it. And that is the tragedy. But it is also the setup for awakening. Because the divine masculine does not heal by being shamed for avoiding. He heals when avoidance stops delivering the peace it once promised. He heals when distance becomes emptiness, when silence becomes pressure, when control becomes exhaustion, when the old strategy begins revealing its own limitations. That is when the path truly begins. And that is why this first chapter matters. Avoidance felt safe for so long because it was never just avoidance. It was armor. It was control. It was identity. It was a way of surviving emotional realities he did not yet know how to hold directly. But armor that once saved a man can eventually suffocate him. And when that happens, the next chapter begins. Chapter 2: The first sign avoidance is failing. The first sign avoidance is failing is not always dramatic. It does not always begin with a confession, or a breakdown, or a sudden return, or some obvious spiritual awakening that everyone around him can see. More often, it begins quietly, as restlessness, as a subtle loss of relief, as the strange realization that the very things he used to do to regulate himself are no longer working in the same way. That is the beginning, because avoidance survives on one promise. If you step back, you will feel better. For a long time, that promise may have seemed true. He withdrew, and the intensity softened. He went silent, and the pressure dropped. He distracted himself, and the ache became manageable. He returned to work, routine, logic, performance, or emotional distance. And the deeper feelings moved back underground where he could function again. That was the pattern. Not perfect peace, but enough relief to keep repeating it. Then one day something changes. He still withdraws, but the relief does not come. He still goes quiet, but the pressure stays. He still distracts himself, but the thoughts return. He still tries to regain control, but the inner world no longer obeys the old commands. And that is the first crack. Avoidance is failing. This is one of the most important phases on the divine masculine journey, because it is the point where the old strategy begins losing credibility inside him. He may not know that yet. He may not have language for it. He may not say, "My coping mechanism is collapsing," but he feels something undeniable. What used to help me escape this is not helping the same way anymore. That realization is deeply unsettling. Because if avoidance has been one of the main ways he has regulated emotion, then its failure does not just create discomfort. It creates instability. It threatens the very structure he has trusted to keep him functional, contained, and emotionally protected. That is why the first sign is often subtle but disturbing. He feels off. Not in a way he can easily explain. Not in a way that logic can quickly solve. But in a way that keeps returning. The silence feels louder. The distance feels heavier. The routine feels emptier. The distractions feel thinner. The old sense of control begins slipping. He may still try all the same things. He may work harder. Stay busier. Think more. Withdraw further. Tell himself he just needs more time, more space, more mental clarity. But something inside him is already beginning to say, "No, this isn't enough anymore." That is the first sign. And it is important to understand that this phase can feel almost more confusing than the original pain. Because when avoidance used to work, at least he had a strategy. It may not have healed him, but it gave him a system, a familiar map, a way to manage what felt too intense. Now even the map feels unreliable. And what happens to a man when the emotional survival strategy he trusted starts breaking down? He becomes restless. Not just mentally. In the body. In the nervous system. In the soul. He may start feeling a pressure he cannot name. A kind of emotional static that follows him through the day. He may notice that even when he is doing all the things that used to keep him centered, something unresolved keeps surfacing. A memory, a thought, a sense of loss, a pull he cannot fully suppress. A quiet ache that returns at the end of every distraction. This is often where he begins realizing, even if only unconsciously, that distance is no longer peace. That matters. Because for a long time, he may have confused the two. He may have believed that stepping away meant becoming calm. That silence meant emotional regulation. That withholding meant strength. That if he could just back out of the emotional intensity, he would eventually restore order inside himself. But when avoidance begins failing, he starts discovering something much harder. Distance can reduce stimulation without bringing truth. Silence can delay emotion without resolving it. Distraction can numb the surface while leaving the wound untouched. And once he truly feels it rather than merely understands it, the whole system starts destabilizing. This is why the first sign is so sacred, even though it does not feel sacred at all. It feels frustrating, uncomfortable, disorienting, because now he is caught in between worlds. The old strategy no longer works the same way. But he does not yet know what to do instead. He is not ready to fully surrender to truth. But he is no longer fully protected by avoidance either. This in-between space is where so much divine masculine unrest begins. He may look the same on the outside. Still functioning. Still controlled. Still going through the motions. But inside, something is breaking. Not in the sense of total collapse yet. In the sense of losing faith in his own emotional escape route. And that can feel terrifying. Because if he cannot escape what he feels the way he used to, then what is left? The answer, of course, is truth. But truth is exactly what the old self has been organized around delaying. So he may resist harder at first. He may double down on the old pattern. He may withdraw more completely, thinking perhaps he just has not gone far enough. He may become more rational, more detached on the surface, more invested in staying composed. He may tell himself that the discomfort means he needs even greater control. But control does not bring the old relief back. That is the key. It may temporarily numb. It may temporarily distract. But the deeper pressure returns. And eventually, he starts recognizing a new kind of discomfort. Not only the pain of the connection, but the pain of the strategy itself. Now avoidance is not just failing to help. It is starting to hurt. The silence feels heavy. The distance feels lonely. The emotional suppression feels exhausting. The act of holding himself back from truth begins creating its own suffering. That is the real beginning of awakening. Not when he first feels deeply. Not when he first understands the connection. But when the thing he used to protect himself starts becoming its own source of pain. Because now he can no longer honestly say the strategy is serving him. This is often the first moment of deep internal contradiction. One part of him still clings to avoidance because it is familiar. Another part of him knows familiarity is no longer enough. One part still wants control. Another part is starting to understand that control has a cost. One part wants to shut the whole thing down. Another part knows shutting it down is no longer bringing peace. This split can feel excruciating. Because he may not have a new language yet. He may not know how to interpret what is happening. He may simply feel more agitated, more emotionally tired, more unable to find relief in the usual places. He may think something is wrong with him when, in reality, something much more meaningful is happening. The soul is withdrawing its permission for avoidance to remain his God. That is what this first sign really is. The beginning of spiritual refusal. A refusal from the deeper self to keep accepting half-peace as peace, half-truth as truth, and emotional exile as strength. And the soul does not always announce this with grace. Sometimes it announces it through disruption, through the failure of old routines, through the inability to stop thinking about what matters, through the return of feelings that no amount of logic can fully reduce, through the strange restlessness that makes even ordinary life feel less comfortable than before. This is why many divine masculines become more internally unsettled before they become more honest. Because honesty often begins where avoidance fails. Not where everything suddenly makes sense, but where the old strategy stops being enough. And that is a deeply vulnerable place. A man can tolerate pain if he believes he knows how to manage it. What destabilizes him is pain plus the loss of the management system. That is this chapter. The first sign avoidance is failing is not just that he still feels. It is that he no longer feels relieved by the ways he used to escape feeling. That difference changes everything. Because now he is standing at the edge of a truth he has long delayed. He cannot keep living from distance and expect his soul to feel whole. He cannot keep using silence and expect his heart to become free. He cannot keep withdrawing from what matters and still call the resulting emptiness peace. This truth does not always arrive as clarity. Sometimes it arrives as exhaustion, as unrest, as the quiet panic of realizing the old emotional escape hatch is no longer opening the same way. And yet, hidden inside that panic is grace. Because if avoidance still worked perfectly, he might stay inside it forever. If the silence still brought full relief, he might keep worshiping silence. If the distance still felt like peace, he might never question whether it was actually a form of loneliness in elegant disguise. So the failure of avoidance, painful as it is, becomes sacred. It is the beginning of the end of false peace. The beginning of a man discovering that the thing which once protected him is no longer capable of carrying him where the soul is trying to go. And that discovery, however uncomfortable, is the first real sign that awakening is getting closer. Because once avoidance begins failing, he has only two choices left. Fight harder to stay asleep, or begin listening to what the failure is trying to teach him. That is where the restlessness begins. And that is where the real journey starts. Chapter 3. He feels restlessness he cannot explain. When avoidance stops working, the first thing the divine masculine often feels is not clarity. It is restlessness. A strange, persistent unrest that follows him into places where he used to find relief. An agitation that does not fully make sense. A pressure in the mind, the body, the chest, the nervous system. A feeling that something inside him is demanding attention, but he does not yet know how to face it directly. That is what makes this phase so difficult. Because he is not simply in pain. He is unsettled. And being unsettled is sometimes even harder than pain. Because pain at least gives the illusion of an object. A reason, a target, a story. But restlessness is more elusive. It feels like an invisible pressure building from within. It follows him when he is trying to work, trying to sleep, trying to distract himself, trying to stay normal, trying to stay functional. He cannot fully place it. He cannot fully quiet it. And most importantly, he cannot fully escape it the way he once could. That is why this phase becomes so intense. For a long time, avoidance may have helped him reduce emotional intensity by creating space. If he felt too much, he stepped back. If the connection got too deep, he got quiet. If vulnerability rose, he buried himself in thought, routine, work, or distance. Those things may not have healed the inner conflict, but they helped him regulate it enough to keep moving. Now something has changed. Now the space does not soothe him the same way. Now the silence feels charged instead of calming. Now distraction gives him only brief fragments of relief before the pressure returns. Now even in ordinary moments, when nothing dramatic is happening outwardly, he feels inwardly unsettled. That is restlessness. And it can show up in countless ways. He may have trouble sleeping. Or he may sleep, but not deeply. He may wake with a feeling in his chest he cannot explain. He may find his thoughts drifting back to the same person, the same memory, the same unfinished truth, no matter how many times he tries to redirect. He may feel more irritable, more inwardly tired, more emotionally stretched thin. He may become unusually quiet, not because he has found peace, but because he can no longer organize the inner noise into neat explanations. This restlessness is often the first real sign that he can no longer outrun himself. And that is terrifying for a man who has built much of his emotional survival around movement away from what overwhelms him. Because what is restlessness really? It is unresolved truth pressing against the walls. It is the body registering what the mind has delayed. It is the nervous system refusing to be fully comforted by the old escape routes. It is the soul beginning to resist the false peace that distance once seemed to provide. That is why the restlessness feels so personal, even when he cannot fully define it. It is not random anxiety. It is not always about one thought, one moment, or one single loss. It is the accumulation of everything avoidance has been trying to manage from a distance. The feelings he did not fully face. The grief he compartmentalized. The longing he minimized. The vulnerability he called too much. The truth he kept pushing into later. Now later is starting to expire. And the inner world knows it. That is why he may find himself doing all the usual things and still not feeling like himself. He may try to stay productive, to stay logical, to stay detached, to stay in control. He may tell himself this is just stress, just exhaustion, just life pressure, just a passing emotional wave. But the body is telling a different story. The body is saying, something is unresolved. Something matters more than you are letting yourself admit. Something is asking to be faced, and your usual methods of escape are no longer enough. This is deeply destabilizing because restlessness is not passive. It does not sit quietly in the background. It interrupts. It follows. It leaks into the spaces where he wanted to feel neutral. It creates a low-grade tension that can become almost constant. And what makes it worse is that he may not have a language for it. He may not say, "My soul is pressing me toward truth." He may say, "I don't know what's wrong with me. I can't shut my mind off. I feel off lately. I'm tired, but I can't rest. I need space, but the space isn't helping. I keep trying to move on, but something keeps pulling me back." That confusion is part of the process. Because restlessness begins before interpretation. The body knows before the mind is willing to name it. The soul feels before the ego can organize the experience into a safe story. The truth rises before he is ready to call it truth. So at first, the restlessness feels almost irrational. Why now? Why this strong? Why does the silence feel so loud? Why can't he just go back to how he was before? Why can't he get relief from the same patterns that used to work? These questions matter because they reveal the exact threshold he is crossing. He is moving from avoidance as regulation to avoidance as suffering, and restlessness is the bridge. It is the feeling of the old system straining under pressure. Pressure from truth. Pressure from memory. Pressure from emotional reality. Pressure from the soul's refusal to keep living in the same divided state. This is why restlessness can feel almost like panic in slow motion. Not always full panic. Sometimes just the edge of it. A feeling that he is losing emotional control. A feeling that what used to stay contained is starting to leak through. A feeling that if he really lets himself feel what is underneath all this agitation, something important inside him may change forever. And he is right. That is exactly what is happening. Because restlessness is not just discomfort. It is invitation. An uncomfortable invitation, yes. A sacred pressure, yes. But an invitation nonetheless. An invitation to stop interpreting unease as something to suppress and start seeing it as something to understand. An invitation to realize that this constant inner movement may not be a malfunction. It may be a signal that the old strategies have reached their limit. A signal that the self he has been protecting is becoming too small for what his soul is trying to feel. A signal that what he once called emotional control is no longer enough to keep him whole. This is where so many divine masculines become even more inwardly split. part of him wants to find a stronger escape, to go deeper into work, to become more detached, to create even more distance, to reduce contact with anything that activates him. But another part knows, maybe for the first time with real force, that escape is no longer bringing peace. So he is left with this unbearable in-between. He cannot fully go back. He does not yet know how to go forward. He cannot fully numb the truth. He does not yet know how to surrender to it. That is why the restlessness can feel so relentless. Because it is not asking to be solved in the old way. It is asking to be listened to. And that may be the hardest thing of all for a wounded masculine, learning that not every emotional disturbance is a problem to control. Sometimes it is a truth trying to emerge. Sometimes the inner agitation is the soul's way of saying, you cannot keep abandoning yourself and still expect to feel peace. That is what the restlessness is often carrying. Not punishment, not chaos for its own sake, but a deeper demand. A demand for emotional honesty, for confrontation with what was buried, for acknowledgement that the mind cannot keep overruling the heart without consequence, for the recognition that what is unfinished within him is now too alive to stay hidden behind routine and silence. This is why sleeplessness, overthinking, body tension, emotional pressure, and intrusive remembering are so common in this phase. They are not random. They are different expressions of the same thing. The system is no longer consenting to unconsciousness. And once that happens, everything starts changing. Not externally right away. Not in neat spiritual language. But internally, yes. He becomes more permeable, more affected, more unable to pretend the connection, the truth, or the emotional consequence of his own avoidance are minor things. And even if he still runs for a while, he runs differently now. Because now he knows running is not working the same way. That knowledge alone is transformative. Because once a man realizes he can no longer outrun himself, he stands at the edge of a new kind of masculine awakening. Not one based on performance, not one based on appearing calm, but one rooted in the terrifying and holy possibility that peace may no longer come from escape. It may have to come from truth. That is the deeper meaning of this chapter. The divine masculine's restlessness is not proof that he is broken. It is proof that the old distance between his inner truth and his lived reality is becoming unbearable. And when that distance becomes unbearable, something sacred is very close. Not comfort yet. Not resolution yet. But breakthrough. Because the moment a man can no longer outrun himself is often the moment he finally becomes available to meet himself. And that is where real awakening begins. Chapter 4. He feels the weight of what he buried. When avoidance stops working, the divine masculine does not only feel the present moment more intensely. He begins feeling the past. Not all at once. Not always clearly. Not always in a way he can explain. But what he buried starts rising. And this is where the journey becomes darker, deeper, and far more personal than he expected. Because many people assume the pain is only about the connection, only about missing someone, only about separation, distance, longing, or the collapse of a particular relationship dynamic. But when avoidance truly begins failing, it reveals something much larger. He was never only avoiding one person. He was avoiding himself, his own grief, his own fear, his own shame, his own unmet needs, his own tenderness, his own memory of what it feels like to want love and not know whether it is safe to receive it. That is what starts surfacing now. The connection may have awakened it. The silence may have intensified it. The almost loss may have exposed it. But the pain itself is often older than the current story. That is why this phase can feel so overwhelming. Because when buried emotions rise, they do not arrive neatly labeled. They do not come one at a time with gentle explanations. They come as pressure, as emotional flooding, as heaviness in the chest, as grief without a clear sentence attached to it, as unexpected sadness, irritability, exhaustion, or inner collapse that seems too big for what is happening on the surface. And that is because he is not only feeling now. He is feeling then. He is feeling all the versions of himself that had to shut down in order to survive. The younger self who learned to stay composed. The wounded self who learned not to ask for too much. The ashamed self who learned to hide vulnerability behind control. The grieving self who never got to grieve properly because grief did not feel safe, useful, or masculine enough to express. Now all of that begins moving. This is what buried pain does when avoidance loses power. It rises from the basement. And when it rises, the divine masculine may not immediately understand what is happening. He may think he is just overwhelmed by the connection. He may think the emotional intensity is coming only from love. He may assume the ache is only about missing someone, or only about regret, or only about the fact that the situation became too painful. But the truth is often deeper. The situation did not create all this pain. It unlocked it. That is why the emotional response can feel so disproportionate, so confusing, so impossible to regulate through the old methods. Because what is moving through him is not just one heartbreak. It is the stored emotional weight of years. Years of self-protection. Years of unprocessed disappointment. Years of emotional self-denial. Years of acting as though control was enough to replace intimacy, honesty, and rest. Now the body is carrying what the mind buried. That is why he may feel sadness without a clear story, or guilt that feels larger than the immediate situation, or fear that seems ancient, or longing that feels almost unbearable, because it is touching not only romantic desire, but the deeper ache of a self that has been emotionally exiled for a very long time. This is the hidden weight, and it is one of the hardest phases of divine masculine awakening, because it forces him into contact with emotions he may have spent years calling irrelevant, inconvenient, or weak. Feelings he learned to bypass. Needs he learned to deny. Wounds he learned to convert into competence, discipline, humor, productivity, silence, or withdrawal. Now those conversions stop holding. The discipline does not comfort him. The silence does not protect him. The work does not fully distract him. The logic does not calm the body. Because the pain beneath all of that is alive now. And once it is alive, it wants witness. This is why he may begin feeling a heaviness that follows him through ordinary life. Not just in spiritual moments, in very normal moments. Driving somewhere, sitting alone, waking up at night, hearing a song, seeing something that reminds him of what he has been trying not to think about. In those moments, the wall between the present and the buried past gets thin. And he feels it. He feels the loneliness he never named. He feels the softness he never protected. He feels the fear of being fully seen. He feels the pain of having needed love while pretending he did not. He feels the shame of how long he built an identity around not feeling what was always there. This is why avoidance failing is so destabilizing. Because it takes away his distance from the deeper emotional inventory of his own life. And perhaps the most painful part is this. He may realize that much of what he called strength was actually an elegant form of self-abandonment. That realization hurts in a specific way. Not because he was trying to destroy himself, but because he was trying to survive. Still, survival can become suffering when it lasts too long. A man who learned not to feel fully may become very good at life on the outside while remaining profoundly disconnected from himself on the inside. He may function beautifully and still carry unspoken sorrow. He may look stable and still be starving emotionally. He may appear strong and still have no real relationship with the softer, more vulnerable parts of his own humanity. So when those parts start returning, it can feel like collapse. But it is not collapse alone. It is retrieval. He is retrieving pieces of himself he left behind. The grieving part, the frightened part, the longing part, the childlike part that still hopes for safety, tenderness, and emotional truth. And because those parts were buried for so long, their return is rarely smooth. They do not come back polished. They come back emotional, unfinished, demanding, tender, raw, sometimes angry, sometimes exhausted, sometimes desperate to be acknowledged. That rawness can make him want to run harder. Because one of the hardest things for the divine masculine to face is not that he feels pain. It is that the pain reveals how deeply human he has always been. Not above hurt. Not above need. Not above grief. not above the desire to be loved and met in truth. And if his old conditioning taught him that true masculinity meant distance from those things, then buried pain becomes more than emotional discomfort. It becomes an identity threat. Now he has to ask, who am I if I am not the composed one? Who am I if I cannot keep managing this through silence? Who am I if I actually need to feel what I spent years stepping around? Who am I if the heart I protected through avoidance is now asking to be included in my life? These questions are terrifying, but they are holy, because buried pain is not rising to destroy him. It is rising to end the split between the man who performs strength and the man who actually aches. The split between the life he built outwardly and the truth he carried inwardly. The split between the image and the reality. And once that split starts closing, the soul gets louder. This is why the connection matters so much in this chapter. Not because it caused all of this, but because it reached deep enough to awaken what less meaningful experiences could not. It touched the places where his defenses were most carefully arranged. It activated memory, longing, and vulnerability at a level that ordinary avoidance could no longer manage. So now the buried material rises with force. And what does he feel? He feels shame. Not always obvious shame, but the quiet shame of realizing how defended he has been, how much he has hidden, how much tenderness he has treated like danger. He feels grief. For what was lost, yes, but also for who he has been, for how long he stayed emotionally half alive, for how much of himself he kept outside the room. He feels fear. Fear that if he really opens to all of this, he will not know how to recover the old version of himself. He feels longing, not only for a person, but for wholeness, for the chance to stop living in such intense internal division. And he feels exhaustion, because carrying buried pain requires tremendous energy. The older the pain, the more effort it often takes to keep it underground. When it starts coming up, the entire system feels the strain. This is why the divine masculine may seem heavier, quieter, more inward, or more emotionally shaken when avoidance stops working. He is not only confronting the connection, he is confronting the stored emotional truth of his own life. And that is a sacred threshold. Because once a man begins feeling the weight of what he buried, he has a choice. He can try to bury it again, or he can begin telling the truth. Not all at once, not perfectly, not in some grand dramatic revelation, but step by step. Truth about what he feels, truth about what he fears, truth about what his silence has cost him, truth about how much pain was sitting underneath the life he called manageable. That truth is where transformation begins. Because buried pain, once felt consciously, stops being just pain. It becomes information. It becomes memory returning for healing. It becomes the doorway through which the divine masculine stops avoiding not just another person, but his own soul. And maybe that is the deepest truth of this chapter. When avoidance stops working, he does not only lose a coping mechanism. He gains access to everything it was protecting him from. That is overwhelming. But it is also grace. Because what is buried cannot be healed from a distance. It must be felt, named, witnessed, and eventually integrated. That is what is happening now. The pain is rising because it no longer agrees to stay hidden. And that means something real, something sacred, something life-changing has already begun. Chapter 5. He feels panic when control stops working. There is a specific kind of fear the divine masculine feels when avoidance stops working. It is not only sadness, not only longing, not only regret. It is panic. Not always visible panic. Not always dramatic. Not always the kind that looks like a breakdown from the outside. Sometimes it is silent panic. Internal panic. The kind that happens when a man realizes the emotional system he has trusted for years is no longer keeping him safe. Because avoidance was never only about distance. It was about control. Control of what he revealed. Control of what he felt. Control of how much access anyone had to his inner world. Control of the pace, the depth, the meaning, the exposure. Control of whether his heart could stay hidden behind a structure that looked stable enough to protect him. So when avoidance stops working, What begins collapsing is not just a coping habit. It is an entire illusion of control. And that is terrifying. Because if control has been one of the main ways he has survived emotional intensity, then losing control does not feel like liberation at first. It feels like danger. That is the hidden psychology of this phase. From the outside, someone may say, why doesn't he just tell the truth? Why doesn't he just admit what he feels? Why doesn't he stop running? But for the wounded masculine, the answer is often much deeper than simple stubbornness. Because telling the truth feels like losing control. Admitting what he feels like losing control. Letting the connection matter openly feels like losing control. Allowing himself to be emotionally affected in a visible, undeniable way feels like stepping into territory his old self was built to avoid at all costs. So when the old strategies stop containing the pressure, panic rises. He may feel it as agitation, as chest tension, as obsessive thinking, as a desperate need to fix, solve, define, or shut something down, as sudden emotional withdrawal, not because he feels less, but because he feels too much and no longer trusts his ability to regulate it. That is what makes this phase so intense. He is not only facing emotion. He is facing emotional exposure without the comfort of control. And for many divine masculines, that is one of the deepest fears of all. Because control did not just make him feel strong. It made him feel safe from collapse. If he stayed measured, he could function. If he stayed distant, he could think. If he stayed guarded, he could keep the more vulnerable parts of himself from taking over. If he stayed silent, he could avoid saying something that would make the feeling too real. But now the feeling is becoming real anyway. Without permission. Without perfect timing. Without his preferred level of management. That is why panic begins showing up. Because his old inner command center is no longer obeyed in the same way. He says, move on. And the heart does not move. He says, stay calm. And the body stays activated. He says, this is over. And the soul keeps returning to what matters. He says, get control. And something deeper answers, you do not have it the way you thought you did. That response can feel almost humiliating to the ego. Because the ego wants mastery. It wants emotional order. It wants to believe that with enough distance, enough intelligence, enough discipline, the inner world can be governed like a machine. But the heart is not a machine. Grief is not a machine. Longing is not a machine. Awakening is not a machine. And when those truths become embodied rather than theoretical, panic often follows. Not because he is weak. Because the structure he trusted is failing. Imagine a man standing inside a house he has built over many years. Every wall, every lock, every habit of thought and feeling was placed there for a reason. The house may not be beautiful, but it is familiar, predictable, contained. He knows how to move inside it. He knows where the exits are. He knows how to shut the windows when too much weather comes in. Then one day the walls stop holding. The wind comes through. The sound gets louder. The pressure changes. The windows no longer seal the way they used to. That is panic. Not because the sky is attacking him, but because the house is no longer protecting him from the sky. This is what happens emotionally when control stops working. He begins to feel exposed to himself. Exposed to his own need. Exposed to his own tenderness. Exposed to the depth of what the connection actually means. Exposed to the fact that he has not been as detached as over it, or as unaffected as he may have tried to appear. And the more exposed he feels, the more the old system may scramble for control again. This is why some divine masculines become more erratic before they become more honest. They may overthink harder, withdraw more sharply, become more emotionally inconsistent, try to force certainty, try to create clean endings where no inner ending exists, try to regain power by reducing contact, minimizing feeling, or telling themselves a stricter story. Why? Because panic wants containment. Panic says, do something. Fix this. Shut this down. Get back to normal. Find the edge of the feeling and push it away before it gets worse. But the tragedy is that the old containment no longer truly works. That is what creates the deeper fear. Not just, I feel too much, but I no longer know how to make myself stop feeling it. This is where the divine masculine often feels the edge of emotional helplessness. A very vulnerable place. A very untrained place. A place where the old masculine conditioning offers almost no useful guidance. Because what was he taught to do here? Feel more. Surrender. Speak vulnerably. Sit inside emotional truth without turning it into a problem to solve? Usually not. More often, he was taught to restore control. So he tries. But now control feels thin. And that thinness creates panic because it forces a deeper confrontation. What if I cannot manage this the old way anymore? What if the version of me built around control is not enough now? What if this connection, this pain, this awakening is stronger than my usual defenses? That is the sacred terror of this stage. Because underneath the panic is a truth he may not yet be ready to name. He is being asked to feel without domination. To be open without total certainty. To let the experience teach him rather than mastering it from above. To surrender the illusion that control is the same as stability. This is hard for anyone. But for the divine masculine whose identity has been tied to composure, restraint, and emotional self-management, it can feel like the beginning of psychological death. And in a sense it is. Not death of the soul. Death of the controlling self. The self that believed everything important could be contained. The self that believed silence was enough. The self that believed if he could just stay disciplined enough, he would never have to be this exposed to his own heart. That self begins panicking because it senses its own limits. And when a self built around control senses its limits, it often experiences that as threat. This is why the panic can come with urgency. A need to make decisions too quickly. A need to define everything too rigidly. A need to either run completely or suddenly fix everything at once. A need to reduce the emotional ambiguity because ambiguity now feels intolerable. He may oscillate between extremes. One moment wanting to disappear. Another moment wanting relief through confession, contact, or clarity. One moment hardening. Another moment softening abruptly. One moment convincing himself none of this matters. Another moment feeling that everything matters too much. That instability is not random. It is what happens when the old center of control is breaking down, but a new center of truth has not fully stabilized yet. This is why he needs compassion here, though not excuse. Because panic can make people reactive, defensive, inconsistent, desperate for relief in ways that are not always mature. Still, the deeper meaning matters. He is panicking because he can no longer rely on the old distance between himself and his own feelings. And that means something real is happening. Something deep enough to shake the system. Something sacred enough to expose the illusion of control. Something powerful enough that his usual emotional architecture is no longer sufficient. This is often the threshold before humility, before honesty, before surrender, before the first genuine admission that he may not need more control. He may need more truth. That is the turning point hidden inside the panic. Because eventually, if he stays with the experience long enough, he begins to see that control was not actually saving him. It was managing exposure. It was buying time. It was preserving an identity. But it was not healing the wound. It was not integrating the feeling. It was not bringing peace. And once he sees that, the panic begins changing shape. It becomes less about regaining old control, and more about surviving truth long enough to let it remake him. That is a sacred shift. Because now he is not just afraid of losing control. He is beginning to understand why control had to fail. It had to fail because what is happening now cannot be lived through at a distance. It cannot be solved by silence. It cannot be mastered through avoidance. It cannot be carried by the old self forever. So yes, he feels panic when control stops working. But beneath that panic is something holy. The end of false safety. The end of emotional domination. The end of the belief that a controlled life is the same as an honest one. And when that belief begins collapsing, the divine masculine stands at one of the most important thresholds of his journey. the moment where he can no longer control his way out of becoming real. Chapter 6. He feels the pain of his own contradiction. There is a specific kind of pain that begins when avoidance stops working. It is not only the pain of missing, not only the pain of longing, not only the pain of emotional overwhelm. It is the pain of contradiction. The pain of realizing that what he felt and how he behaved were not the same thing. That is one of the hardest truths for the divine masculine to face. Because for a long time, he may have been able to keep those two worlds separate. He could feel deeply on the inside and still stay silent on the outside. He could sense the truth of the connection and still delay action. He could care, miss, ache, think, remember, and privately know while still protecting himself through withdrawal, confusion, distance, or emotional withholding. And as long as avoidance still worked, that contradiction remained somewhat manageable. Painful, yes, but manageable. He could tell himself, I feel this, but I have reasons. I care, but I need space. I know this matters, but the timing is wrong. I'm affected, but I can't deal with it right now. Those explanations created room between his heart and his behavior. Room where he could continue living in division without fully collapsing under the weight of it. But when avoidance stops working, that room begins to disappear. Now he feels the contradiction directly. He feels that he loved and still withdrew. That he knew and still delayed. That he cared and still withheld truth. That he felt something sacred and still let fear speak louder than honesty. That realization hurts in a way that ordinary heartbreak does not. Because now the pain is not only about what happened. It is about who he was while it was happening. This is where remorse begins deepening. Not surface regret. Not just, I miss this. Not just, maybe I made a mistake. Something heavier. Something closer to. I can now see the gap between what my soul knew and what my fear made me do. That gap is agonizing. Because once a man truly sees that, he can no longer comfortably remain the person who created it. He begins feeling the emotional cost of his own inconsistency. He begins understanding that the suffering is not only coming from loss, but from internal division. He is hurting not only because the connection mattered, but because he acted against what he himself knew mattered. That is the contradiction. And contradiction has weight. He feels the weight of unspoken truth. The weight of silence where honesty was needed. The weight of distance where tenderness existed underneath. The weight of pretending not to care in the ways his nervous system, his thoughts, and his heart clearly reveal he did care. This is why the divine masculine often becomes much more inwardly shaken once avoidance fails. He is no longer able to keep the story neat. He can no longer say, it just wasn't right, if part of him knows something much deeper was true. He can no longer hide behind, I needed space, if the space itself is now filled with the ache of what his fear created. Now he is living inside emotional evidence. Evidence that he was affected. Evidence that he was not neutral. Evidence that what he pushed away did not become less real because he stepped back from it. Evidence that silence did not erase meaning. Evidence that the old self was protecting something, yes, but also damaging something. That is a hard thing to face. Because contradiction attacks identity. It forces a man to see that he may not be who he thought he was. Or more precisely, that the version of himself he trusted may have been less honest, less brave, less emotionally integrated than he wanted to believe. He may have thought, I'm just careful. Now he wonders, was I afraid? He may have thought, I was being rational. Now he wonders, was I using logic to avoid truth? He may have thought, I needed distance to stay stable. Now he wonders, did distance only protect the wound while hurting everything else? These questions sting because they strip away innocence. Not innocence in the moral sense that he is evil, but innocence in the psychological sense that he can no longer fully believe his own defenses. That is the beginning of painful clarity. And painful clarity is one of the strongest signs that real awakening is getting closer. Because once a man begins feeling the pain of his own contradiction, he cannot remain spiritually numb in the same way. He may still resist. He may still delay. He may still struggle to speak. But inwardly, the old peace is gone. The old certainty is gone. The old polished self-story is gone. Now he knows too much. He knows that feeling deeply while behaving defensively has consequences. He knows that love unexpressed can still wound. He knows that fear dressed up as control, timing, or caution is still fear. He knows that silence can become a betrayal not only of the other person, but of his own soul. That is the pain. And perhaps the deepest wound inside it is this. He begins to see how much energy he spent protecting himself from vulnerability, only to end up hurt by the very protection he trusted. That is devastating. Because contradiction is exhausting. To feel one thing and do another. To know and not act. To want closeness and choose distance. To love and still let the old self interrupt the expression of that love. It tears at him from the inside. That is why this phase can feel like internal war. One part of him says, "You had to protect yourself." Another part says, "But at what cost?" One part says, "You weren't ready." Another part says, "But how long were you going to keep saying that while something sacred waited inside your hesitation?" One part says, "You were doing your best." Another part says, "Then why does your soul feel so burdened by the man you became in those moments?" These are not easy questions, but they are holy questions. Because this is where the divine masculine stops suffering only from emotion and begins suffering from misalignment. From the fact that the inner truth and the outer behavior no longer fit together cleanly. From the fact that the soul is now awake enough to feel how painful it is to live divided. That division becomes unbearable over time. Especially when the connection was real. Especially when the love was real. Especially when the silence and distance were not proof of emptiness, but proof of fear. Because then he cannot tell himself a simple story anymore. He cannot say, "It meant nothing," because his body knows better. He cannot say, "I felt nothing," because the grief says otherwise. He cannot say, "I was fine," because the restlessness has already exposed the lie. So what remains? Truth. Painful truth. Uncomfortable truth. Humbling truth. Truth that says, "I cared more than I admitted. I knew more than I acted on. I felt more than I allowed myself to show. And I let the old self interrupt what my heart was trying to tell me." This is where contradiction starts becoming unbearable enough to transform him. Because eventually he must choose. Not necessarily between two people. Not necessarily between staying and leaving in a simple external sense. But between two selves. The self who continues living in contradiction. And the self who begins telling the truth. The self who still protects fear. And the self who no longer wants fear making sacred decisions. The self who wants relief through distance. And the self who begins realizing relief will not come until he stops betraying what he feels. That is why this chapter matters so much. Because the pain of contradiction is often one of the final fires before real change. Not because pain itself is noble, but because contradiction cannot be endured forever once consciousness deepens. A man can live divided for years while somewhat asleep. But once awakening begins, division becomes suffering. And suffering becomes teacher. It teaches him that silence is not neutral. That withholding has weight. That emotional dishonesty wounds more than the ego admits. That love cannot be honored through endless internal secrecy, while external behavior keeps serving fear. This realization can make him grieve. Grieve what he did not say. What he did not do. How long he stood in between. How many times he called avoidance wisdom just because it was familiar. But grief here is not punishment. It is conscience awakening. It is the soul saying, "You are no longer allowed to call this peace." And once the soul says that clearly enough, the old life becomes harder to maintain. He cannot keep performing calm when inside he feels the cost. He cannot keep glorifying distance when he now knows what distance has done. He cannot keep using timing as a shield when the deeper issue is that he was split within himself. This is what the divine masculine feels when contradiction becomes conscious. Shame, yes. Sorrow, yes. Regret, yes. But also a deep, raw need for alignment. That need is sacred. Because it means he is no longer satisfied with merely feeling. He wants to stop being divided from what he feels. And that is where real transformation begins. Not when the contradiction first appears, but when he can no longer bear carrying it. That is the turning point. The moment a man realizes that the greatest pain is not only losing what mattered. It is becoming someone who acted against what mattered, and now must face that truth without running from it. And if he stays with that truth long enough, it does not only break him, it remakes him. Because once contradiction hurts more than honesty, he is finally standing at the edge of a new masculine path. One where he no longer wants to protect himself through division. One where he begins wanting wholeness more than image. And that is where avoidance truly starts dying. Chapter 7. He feels the emptiness of the old self. There comes a point when the divine masculine no longer just feels pain. He feels emptiness. Not ordinary emptiness. Not boredom. Not a passing low mood. A deeper emptiness. The kind that makes the old version of him stop feeling strong and start feeling hollow. This is one of the most important phases of the journey. Because once avoidance stops working and contradiction becomes conscious, he begins confronting something he may have escaped for years. The life built around the old self no longer feels livable in the same way. That is the real shock. Because for a long time, the old self may have seemed functional, even admirable. It may have helped him succeed, stay composed, manage life, avoid collapse, keep things under control. It may have made him look disciplined, rational, independent, hard to shake. But now the same identity begins feeling empty. The same silence that once felt protective now feels lonely. The same distance that once felt mature now feels cold. The same control that once felt stabilizing now feels exhausting. The same emotional restraint that once looked like strength now feels like starvation of the soul. That is what changes. He stops being impressed by the old self. And that loss of admiration is huge. Because the old self survives partly through image. It tells him, this is who you are. This is what makes you strong. This is how you stay safe. This is how you avoid becoming too needy, too vulnerable, too exposed. For years, he may have believed that story. He may have built his identity around it. He may have genuinely trusted it. But when avoidance fails and buried truth starts rising, the image cracks. He starts seeing the old self differently. Not as peace. As defense. Not as stability. As emotional exile. Not as wisdom. As fear wearing a disciplined face. That realization creates emptiness because once the old identity loses meaning, he is left standing in a strange place. He cannot fully return to who he was. But he has not yet fully become who he is meant to be. This is the emptiness of the in-between. And it can feel devastating. Because if a man has spent years defining himself through composure, control, and emotional distance, then what happens when those traits no longer satisfy him? What happens when the structure he used to call me begins feeling like a prison? What happens when he realizes he has built a life around surviving without actually knowing how to live in emotional truth? He feels empty. He may still be doing all the same things. Working. Moving through responsibilities. Showing up externally. But inwardly something feels missing. The routines do not nourish him the same way. The distractions do not fill the same space. The identity he trusted no longer gives him a sense of wholeness. The life organized around the old self begins to feel too small for what his soul now knows. And this is where the journey becomes existential. Because now the divine masculine is no longer just dealing with one feeling or one connection. He is confronting the possibility that the man he thought he was never the whole truth. That is terrifying. Because identity, even when painful, gives structure. It tells him how to move, how to interpret himself, how to stay intact. But when that identity begins collapsing, he is left without the familiar certainty that once held his world together. This is why the emptiness can feel so disorienting. He may ask himself, why does nothing feel enough anymore? Why does the old life feel flat? Why do the things that used to stabilize me now feel heavy? Why does being fine suddenly feel like a lie I can no longer live inside comfortably? These are sacred questions. Because they reveal that the old self is not just failing emotionally. It is losing spiritual authority. The soul is no longer consenting to the old arrangement. No longer consenting to a life built on partial presence. No longer consenting to emotional self-abandonment dressed up as discipline. No longer consenting to control as the highest value. That refusal creates emptiness before it creates new form. This is important to understand. The emptiness is not only a void. It is a clearing away of what no longer nourishes him. A clearing away of identities that were built from pain, not essence. A clearing away of the false certainty that told him emotional distance was enough. Still, clearings do not feel peaceful at first. They feel like loss. Loss of old control. Loss of old meaning. Loss of the old image of strength. Loss of the version of masculinity that once helped him feel superior to vulnerability. That loss can make him feel profoundly alone. Because the old self may have kept him separated from others. Yes, but now it is also separating him from the life he is currently living. He begins seeing that he is not only disconnected from love, he is disconnected from himself, from vitality, from inner coherence, from the deeper truth his soul is trying to move toward. This is why the emptiness often intensifies right before awakening deepens. Because once the old self loses its glamour, the masculine can no longer fully hide inside it. He can still perform it. He can still wear it. He can still act it out in moments. But he no longer believes in it the same way. And once belief dies, emptiness rushes in. Not to punish him. To expose that he cannot keep living on borrowed identity forever. The old self was borrowed from survival. Borrowed from conditioning. Borrowed from fear. Borrowed from whatever taught him that to be a man meant to stay guarded rather than real. Now the soul wants something else. Something truer. Something softer without being weak. Something grounded without being shut down. Something emotionally honest without collapsing into chaos. But before that new self is born, the old one often has to feel deeply empty. Because emptiness is what makes false belonging intolerable. It is what forces him to admit that the version of masculinity he has been inhabiting is no longer enough. That it may have protected him once, but now it is suffocating him. That it may have made him look strong, but it left him internally undernourished. And perhaps the most painful part of this emptiness is realizing that he has participated in his own starvation. Not maliciously, not consciously, but really. He may begin seeing that he has spent years choosing what kept him emotionally safe over what could have made him whole. That he has repeatedly stepped away from depth, from truth, from tenderness, because the old self could not trust those things. That he has mistaken the absence of emotional chaos for the presence of peace. But peace is not the same as numbness. And once he truly sees that, the emptiness becomes unavoidable. The old self no longer satisfies. The false life no longer comforts. The image no longer feeds the soul. This is why so many divine masculines become inwardly quieter, heavier, more reflective, and more emotionally stripped down in this phase. They are not only hurting over a connection, they are beginning to grieve an identity. An identity that promised strength, but delivered separation. An identity that promised control, but created internal deadness. An identity that helped them survive, but not fully live. That grief is part of the emptiness. Because before a new self can fully emerge, the old one must be mourned. And yes, that sounds strange. Why mourn something false? Because false identities still cost energy to build, still hold memory, still carry years of effort, adaptation, pride, and self-protection. When they begin collapsing, the man inside them often feels as though he is losing not only a defense, but a whole way of being in the world. That loss deserves to be named. Not glorified, but named. Because a masculine awakening that does not acknowledge the grief of identity loss remains shallow. The old self may have been incomplete, but it was still his home for a long time. And when home starts feeling empty, the soul enters one of its most vulnerable thresholds. But this is also where truth grows. Because in the emptiness, he starts hearing something else. A deeper hunger. Not just for relief. Not just for the connection. Not just for the pain to stop. A hunger for realness. for a life that does not require constant self-suppression, for emotional truth that does not have to hide behind performance, for love that does not have to fight his defenses just to reach him, for a version of masculinity that is no longer built around fear of feeling. That hunger is the beginning of the new self. It does not arrive fully formed. It arrives as dissatisfaction with the old self, as a refusal to keep pretending the old ways still nourish him, as the quiet, painful understanding that what used to feel like identity now feels like emptiness. And maybe that is the deepest truth of this chapter. When avoidance stops working, the divine masculine does not only lose a coping mechanism. He loses faith in the old self that depended on it. That loss creates emptiness. But it is sacred emptiness, because it clears space for something truer to emerge. The old self feels empty because it was never the full measure of who he was. And once he can no longer live comfortably inside that partial identity, awakening moves closer than ever before. Because the moment a man stops wanting to go back to the old self, even if he still fears what comes next, is often the moment his real life begins waiting at the edge of truth. Chapter 8. He feels longing without a place to hide. There is a moment in the divine masculine journey when longing becomes unavoidable. Not because he suddenly starts feeling for the first time. He may have been feeling all along. But because now, for the first time, he has nowhere left to hide from what he feels. That changes everything. Because longing at a distance can be managed for a while. It can be softened by avoidance, diluted by distraction, buried under routine, explained away by logic, or pushed into the background through silence. As long as avoidance still works, longing remains something he can partially outrun. Not erase but reduce. Not heal but contain. But when avoidance stops working, longing changes shape. It becomes louder, more embodied, more personal, more impossible to dismiss as just a phase, just stress, just timing, just attachment, just intensity that will fade if he keeps himself busy enough. Now the heart is no longer staying in the background. Now it becomes the loudest thing in the room. That is why this phase feels so intense. Because longing without a hiding place is not gentle. It follows him into ordinary life, into quiet moments, into the spaces that used to be neutral, into sleep, into work, into memory. He remembers more, feels more, replays more. Not always because he wants to. Sometimes because the soul will no longer let him keep pretending the bond was less significant than it was. This is one of the hardest thresholds for the divine masculine. Because longing stripped of avoidance becomes revelation. It reveals what mattered. It reveals what never truly left. It reveals the emotional truth beneath all the intellectual control. And for a man who once survived by staying one step removed from his own heart, that revelation can feel almost unbearable. Because now he cannot reduce the feeling to something smaller. He cannot say, "It was just a moment," if the moment is still living in him. He cannot say, "I've moved on," if the body still tightens with memory. He cannot say, "It was only in my head," if the ache keeps returning to the chest, the thoughts, the quiet of the night. Now longing has become evidence. Evidence that the connection mattered. Evidence that his inner truth did not disappear because he created distance. Evidence that silence did not dissolve the bond. Evidence that what he has been trying to control is deeper than preference, deeper than convenience, deeper than the old stories he used to explain it away. That is why longing becomes so sacred at this stage. Because it is no longer just desire. It is contact. Contact with what his soul values. Contact with the tenderness he buried. Contact with the truth that what he has been trying to manage emotionally is still alive inside him, still asking to be acknowledged. And longing feels different when it can no longer be hidden. It becomes less romanticized and more raw. He may miss her in ways that surprise him. Not just the idea of her, but her actual presence. Her energy. Her voice. The way she made him feel more seen, more shaken, more alive. More exposed to himself than he had been in a long time. He may replay moments. Words he did not say. Things he almost admitted. Silences that now feel heavy because he knows what was underneath them. He may revisit ordinary memories and suddenly feel how much they carried. How much meaning he was living inside without fully allowing himself to admit it then. This is what happens when longing no longer has a place to hide. Memory sharpens. Not always in a sweet way. Sometimes in a devastating way. Because now memory becomes more than nostalgia. It becomes emotional evidence of what he has been trying to step around. And the more he feels that evidence, the harder it becomes to stay loyal to the stories that once protected him. This was just complicated. Maybe. But why does it still live in him this deeply? It was bad timing. Maybe. But why does timing now feel like a shallow explanation for something the soul still treats as unfinished? I needed space. Maybe. But why is the space now full of her absence in a way that feels more revealing than relieving? These questions begin haunting the old self. Because longing at this stage is no longer asking whether the connection was real. It is asking whether he can keep living against what he knows was real. That is where the suffering deepens. Because longing without avoidance removes the buffer. It no longer lets him stay at a safe emotional distance from his own truth. It pulls him directly into the experience of wanting, missing, aching, regretting, and sensing the depth of what he once thought he could keep under control. This is why many divine masculines become quieter, more introspective, more emotionally serious when this phase begins. Not because they have found answers, but because the old escape routes are gone and all that remains is the emotional reality itself. They are left with the ache. And ache has its own language. It says, "This mattered. This reached you. This changed you. This did not leave just because you stepped away. This is not something you can keep reducing without reducing yourself." That last truth may be the hardest one. Because when longing becomes undeniable, he begins realizing that minimizing the connection was also minimizing his own experience, his own heart, his own vulnerability, his own humanity. And that can create shame. Not because longing is shameful, but because he may see how long he treated his own deeper feelings as something to manage rather than honor. He may begin asking, why did I keep pretending this was smaller than it was? Why did I make my own tenderness into a problem to solve? Why did I trust avoidance more than my own heart? These are painful questions, but they are also awakening questions. Because longing, when it can no longer be avoided, becomes one of the clearest mirrors of all. It shows him not only what he wants, but what he has been unwilling to admit he wants. Not only what he feels, but how long he has lived in contradiction with what he feels. And that contradiction becomes unbearable. Especially because longing now has no place to go. He cannot numb it the old way. He cannot outthink it. He cannot fully replace it with other distractions. He cannot call it weakness and still believe himself. So he sits with it. Maybe reluctantly. Maybe awkwardly. Maybe in silence. But he sits with it more than before. And in that sitting, something changes. Longing stops being just pain. It starts becoming truth. Truth about what his heart has chosen. Truth about the depth of the bond. Truth about how much fear it took to keep stepping away from something that touched him this deeply. Truth about the self he has been protecting, and whether that self is still worth protecting at the cost of such intense inner division. This is why longing is so transformative when it has nowhere left to hide. Because at that point, it ceases to be a passing emotion. It becomes a teacher. It teaches him what matters. It teaches him what his soul will not let him forget. It teaches him that distance is not the same as detachment. It teaches him that silence is not the same as freedom. It teaches him that avoiding the feeling did not make the feeling less true. And perhaps most of all, it teaches him that the heart has a memory the ego cannot erase. A sacred memory. A body memory. A soul memory. The kind that keeps returning, not to torture him, but to make sure he does not keep building a life around what is emotionally false. That is why this chapter matters so much. Because longing without a place to hide is often the moment the divine masculine begins surrendering to the fact that he cannot keep pretending. He may not yet know what to do. He may not yet have the courage to fully act. He may still be processing, still afraid, still humbled by how much he feels. But one thing has changed. He can no longer honestly say the feeling is not there. And once a man reaches that threshold, everything begins to shift. Because the old self depended on emotional ambiguity, on the ability to blur meaning, to stay half-honest, to keep one foot in truth and one foot in distance. But longing strips away ambiguity. It says, no, this is real enough to ache, real enough to haunt, real enough to live inside your body, whether you have the perfect language for it or not. That kind of truth changes a man. Slowly sometimes, messily sometimes, painfully often, but deeply. Because now he is not only missing someone, he is being initiated into contact with the part of himself that can no longer survive through denial. That is the sacred invitation hidden inside longing. Not just to feel more, but to stop lying about what he feels. And maybe that is the deepest truth of this chapter. When avoidance stops working, longing does not become louder to punish him. It becomes louder because the soul is done allowing him to hide from what matters. And once longing has nowhere left to hide, the divine masculine stands at one of the holiest thresholds of all. The moment when the heart finally becomes louder than the strategies built to silence it. That is when awakening stops being optional. That is when truth gets closer than fear. And that is when the man who once ran begins, however imperfectly, to realize that what he truly wants is no longer something he can afford to keep hiding from. Chapter 9, he feels humility right before change. There is a moment on this journey when the divine masculine stops feeling only pain and starts feeling humbled by it. That is a very different stage. Pain alone can still make a man defensive. It can make him retreat. It can make him confused, reactive, withdrawn, or desperate for relief. Pain alone can still leave the ego in charge, trying to manage the emotional fire without truly letting it transform him. But humility changes the quality of the experience. Humility is what happens when the old self begins losing its authority. When he stops merely suffering and starts recognizing what his suffering is revealing. When he can no longer glorify the strategies that once made him feel strong. When he begins understanding that the thing breaking him open is not only loss, but truth. That is why humility often appears right before real change. Because humility is the moment the ego stops arguing with reality quite so loudly. For a long time, the divine masculine may have believed his distance made sense, that his silence was necessary, that his withdrawal was wise, that his confusion was valid enough to justify his hesitation, that his need for control, his caution, his restraint, his emotional self-protection were all signs of maturity, or at least signs that he was doing the best he could under difficult circumstances. And maybe in part that was true. But when avoidance stops working, when the pain deepens, when the old self becomes empty, when longing has nowhere left to hide, a new awareness begins to emerge. The old strategies were not saving him. They were costing him. That realization is humiliating in the most sacred sense of the word. Not humiliating because it makes him worthless. Humiliating because it brings him back down to truth. It shows him that he is not above heartbreak, not above vulnerability, not above the consequences of fear, not above the emotional reality he spent so long trying to stay one step removed from. This is where the divine masculine begins feeling a different kind of ache. Not just the ache of missing, but the ache of seeing himself more clearly. Seeing how long he hid behind things that no longer feel honorable. Seeing how much emotional labor he left unspoken, unclaimed, unmet. Seeing how often he asked avoidance to do what only honesty could do. Seeing that the version of masculinity he trusted may have been more wounded than wise. That is humility. It is the collapse of self-deception. And once that begins, something incredibly important happens. He stops being impressed by his own defenses. That is one of the clearest signs that change is close. Because as long as he still admires the distance, he will keep choosing it. As long as he still believes silence is power, he will keep hiding there. As long as he still thinks emotional control is more sacred than emotional truth, he will continue worshiping the very things that keep him divided. But humility makes those old strategies lose their glamour. Now distance does not feel noble. It feels lonely. Now silence does not feel wise. It feels costly. Now confusion does not feel protective. It feels thin. Now the old self does not feel strong. It feels tired. That is the emotional atmosphere of humility. And humility does not always look dramatic. Sometimes it is quiet. A man becomes more inward, more reflective, less performative, less eager to defend every choice, less certain that his old explanations are enough. He may feel a heaviness in this phase, but it is different from the earlier panic. Panic says, regain control. Humility says, control was never really the answer. Panic wants escape. Humility begins allowing truth to stay in the room. That is a sacred difference. Because once truth is allowed to remain, he starts seeing things he could not bear to see before. He sees where fear was disguising itself as caution, where ego was disguising itself as self-respect, where emotional immaturity was disguised as needing time, where avoidance was not preserving peace, but postponing confrontation. And yes, that hurts. But it also softens him. Not weakness. Softness. The kind of softness that comes when a man realizes he has been harder than he needed to be, more defended than he needed to be, more committed to preserving a false image of strength than to actually becoming whole. That realization often brings grief. Grief for what he did not say. Grief for how long he stayed hidden. Grief for the version of himself who did not yet know how to love without fear taking over the whole room. But now the grief is no longer only emotional pain. It is instruction. It teaches him what matters. It teaches him what no longer works. It teaches him that his soul wants more than survival, more than image, more than detachment dressed up as strength. This is why humility is such a holy threshold right before change. Because humility prepares the heart for truth in a way pain alone cannot. Pain can shake him. Humility can open him. Pain can destabilize the old structure. Humility can make him willing to stop rebuilding the same structure again. Pain can make him miss. Humility can make him honest about what his fear has done. And honesty is where change begins becoming real. Not perfect. Not polished. But real. A humbled divine masculine starts asking different questions. Not, how do I get out of this feeling? But, what is this feeling trying to show me? Not, how do I protect my image? But, what is my image costing my soul? Not, how do I justify my distance? But, what has distance really done? These are change-making questions. Because they move him from defense into reflection. From performance into sincerity, from old masculine conditioning into a more awakened form of masculine truth. And that truth is not flashy. It is often tender, quiet, uncomfortable, stripped down. He may begin feeling remorse without immediately trying to explain it away. He may begin seeing the feminine more clearly, not as an emotional force to manage, but as a mirror he did not fully know how to meet before. He may start realizing that what he once called too much was sometimes simply too true for the old self to tolerate. That is humility. The willingness to admit that the issue was never only outside of him. That the pressure came from what the connection awakened. Yes, but also from what he kept refusing to face within himself. Once he admits that, even silently, the old identity begins losing its final grip. Because the old identity depends on blame, on distance, on explanation, on staying one level removed from responsibility. But humility brings him closer, closer to his own impact, closer to his own emotional reality, closer to the part of himself that no longer wants to keep hiding behind the same patterns. This is why humility often feels like the beginning of a new kind of masculinity. One less concerned with looking strong. One more concerned with being true. One less interested in staying unreadable. One more willing to be known. One less devoted to emotional control. One more open to emotional integrity. That shift does not always happen all at once, but when it begins, it is unmistakable. He stops romanticizing the old self. Stops glorifying the avoidance. Stops trusting the polished story more than the raw truth underneath it. And once a man reaches that point, change gets very close. Because humility lowers the defenses enough for truth to enter. That is why this chapter sits right before transformation. Not because humility is the final destination, but because humility makes the final surrender possible. A man cannot change deeply while still worshiping the self that hurts him. He cannot step into truth while still defending what fear built. He cannot meet sacred love while still believing his old ways deserve the throne. Humility removes the throne. And in that removal, something else begins rising. Conscience, tenderness, honesty, a deeper reverence for what the connection really is. A more mature awareness of what it means to stop protecting the wound and start honoring the truth. That is the sacred preparation before change. He begins to feel less like the man who knows everything, and more like the man who is finally ready to learn from what broke him. Less like the one in control. More like the one who understands that control cannot replace integrity. Less like the one who gets to stay untouched. More like the one who finally knows that being touched by truth is not weakness. It is awakening. And maybe that is the deepest truth of this chapter. When avoidance stops working, humility is what saves the divine masculine from simply becoming harder. Without humility, pain can make him bitter. With humility, pain can make him real. Without humility, loss becomes punishment. With humility, loss becomes revelation. Without humility, the old self rebuilds its walls. With humility, the old self begins stepping down. That is why humility comes right before change. Because it is the moment when he stops asking how to preserve who he has been, and begins asking whether who he has been is worthy of leading him any farther. That question changes everything. And once a man becomes willing to ask it honestly, transformation is no longer far away. It is already beginning. Chapter 10: Why this is the beginning of real awakening. When avoidance stops working, it can feel like everything is falling apart. The silence no longer protects him. The distance no longer calms him. The control no longer saves him. The old identity no longer comforts him. And for the divine masculine, this can feel terrifying. Because if avoidance was the structure that helped him survive, then its collapse does not feel peaceful at first. It feels like losing the map, losing the shield, losing the version of himself that knew how to function without fully facing the truth. But this is the sacred paradox. What feels like collapse is often the beginning of awakening. Not because pain is beautiful. Not because suffering should be worshipped. Not because confusion itself is spiritual. But because there comes a moment when the soul can no longer tolerate the old arrangement. The old arrangement where he feels deeply but hides it. Where he longs but stays silent. Where he knows but does not act. Where he protects the wound and calls that strength. Where he remains loyal to fear and still hopes for peace. That arrangement eventually becomes unbearable. And that unbearable feeling is not the end. It is the threshold. Because once avoidance fails, he is no longer protected from truth in the old way. He can no longer fully escape the connection, the pain, the longing, the contradiction, the buried grief, or the emotional reality of who he has been. He is brought face to face with himself. And this is where real awakening begins. Real awakening does not begin when he says the right spiritual words. It does not begin when he intellectualizes the connection. It does not begin when he merely suffers. It begins when he can no longer keep betraying what his own soul knows. That is the real turning point. Not perfection. Not instant clarity. Not a smooth return to peace. But honesty. Honesty about what he feels. Honesty about what avoidance cost him. Honesty about how much of his old life was built around not feeling too much, not needing too much, not revealing too much. Honesty about the fact that the very strategies that once made him feel safe are now keeping him from the life, love, and wholeness he actually wants. This is why the breakdown of avoidance is so sacred. Because avoidance was never just a habit. It was a system of silence, a system of emotional distance, a system of self-protection, a system of identity. And when that system fails, the divine masculine is forced into a deeper question. If I can no longer live this way, then who am I becoming? That question is holy. Because now he is no longer simply reacting to pain. He is being initiated by it. initiated into emotional truth, into accountability, into tenderness, into conscience, into the painful but beautiful realization that the man he has been cannot take him where his soul is trying to go. That is awakening, not a reward, not a fantasy, not just a romantic realization, a dismantling, a stripping away of what is false, a breaking of what has become too small, a confrontation with everything he used to call peace that was really only distance from himself. And this is why the divine masculine often looks more shaken before he looks more whole. Because before truth becomes grounding, it becomes disruptive. Before awakening becomes wisdom, it becomes exposure. Before he rises, he must first feel what the old self can no longer carry. That is the sacred pain of this final phase. He is not just missing someone. He is meeting himself. He is meeting the scared parts, the ashamed parts, the grieving parts, the parts that still do not know how to receive love without fear, the parts that built an identity around emotional survival and now must learn something new. That learning is slow sometimes, messy often, humbling always, but it is real. Because the moment avoidance stops working, he loses the ability to remain comfortably divided. He can no longer live in the old split between what he knows inwardly and how he behaves outwardly without feeling the cost. He can no longer hide behind timing, confusion, or emotional control without sensing how empty those things have become. This is why awakening begins here. Not because the pain finally punishes him enough, but because the pain finally reveals enough. It reveals that distance is not peace, that silence is not freedom, that control is not wholeness, that the old self may have survived, but it did not truly live. And once he knows that deeply in the body, in the heart, in the conscience, he cannot unknow it. He may still hesitate, still struggle, still fear what comes next. But something essential has changed. He is no longer asleep in the same way. The old defenses have lost their innocence. The old identity has lost its glamour. The old patterns no longer feel wise, only expensive. That is the beginning of real awakening. Because now he is not just looking for relief. He is looking for truth. Not just a way to stop hurting, but a way to stop living falsely. And that desire changes everything. It softens him. It humbles him. It makes him more available to conscience, more open to responsibility, more willing to question who he has been and what must now be left behind. This is the hidden blessing of avoidance failing. It feels like loss. But sometimes what he is losing is only the false peace that kept him disconnected from himself. What he gains is far more sacred. The chance to become real. The chance to stop mistaking numbness for strength. The chance to stop running from the very heart that came to guide him. The chance to finally understand that love is not the thing destroying him. The avoidance was. And once he really sees that, the path changes forever. Because now the question is no longer, how do I get back in control? Now the question becomes, how do I become someone who no longer needs control more than truth? That is awakening. That is the beginning of the divine masculine becoming emotionally honest enough to live in alignment with what matters. So if you are watching this phase unfold, whether in yourself or in someone you love, remember this. When avoidance stops working, it may feel like the end of stability. But sometimes it is the end of illusion. An illusion must end before real peace can begin. Because the divine masculine does not awaken when he finally perfects his defenses. He awakens when his defenses stop being enough to keep him from his own soul. That is the sacred truth. And that is why this painful phase is not just breakdown. It is breakthrough. So if this message found you at the right time, let this be your reminder. Not every collapse is failure. Not every restless night means you are lost. Not every painful unraveling means the path is broken. Sometimes the soul removes the escape route because truth is finally ready to enter. Sometimes avoidance stops working because the heart is ready to be heard. Sometimes the old self starts falling apart because a more honest self is trying to rise. And sometimes the most sacred awakening begins the moment a man realizes he can no longer run from himself and still call that peace. If this resonated with you, comment below. Avoidance stopped working. And tell me, have you ever experienced the moment when running no longer brought relief, only truth? Your story may be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. Subscribe for more divine masculine, twin flame, and spiritual psychology content.
Thank you for spending this moment with me. If this message resonated with your soul, remember to subscribe and continue this journey with us here on Twin Flame Journey. And always remember, what is meant for your soul will always find its way back to you. Until next time, beautiful soul, trust the journey.